Hi guys, I asked people what topics about Islam and Dawah claims we should address or where there is confusion, and this was next on the list. How does Islam address slavery? And why is it that Muslim apologists even make the claim that Islam actually abolished slavery? Now first off, this is not about slavery in the Bible, not about the Arabic or European slave trade and the competition who had more slaves. It is not about Arabs taking slaves all the way up to Ireland either. It's a high-level view at what Muslims believe based on Islamic texts, the Quran and the secondary texts, the Sunnah. So let's begin by asking what slavery is, how it appears in the Quran, and what do other Islamic texts say about slavery, and then looking at the implementation today. Slavery is considered to be the ownership of other human beings, where these slaves have no rights and are kept alive to protect the investment of the owner. Now, in Islam, slavery appears in two different forms. One, the human object, male or male, as a laborer. And then there's the, usually female, sex slave. And just to stress this point, in the Quran there is no mention of the actual word slave. So please don't come with that, because the word did not exist yet, okay? The word slave as a person who is the chattel or property of another only appeared a few centuries ago. In the Quran, slaves are referred to as ma malakat aymanukum. Wikipedia, the Muslim propaganda channel, states that Bernard Lewis translates this ma malakat aymanukum as those whom you own. Yusuf Ali translates it as those whom your right hands possess, and so does Shakir. Dawood translates the phrase a little bit more idiomatically as those whom you own as slaves. What all these expressions indicate is that they establish ownership of another human being with proprietary rights, not a kind of a work contract, but ownership without human rights or the right to quit and work somewhere else or make any other demand for that matter. Slaves are not consulted on anything. Slaves could not own slaves. They were captured, bought, and sold in the slave section of a market, or maybe given as presents, like other goods with a corresponding financial value. Captured men are killed, sold, enslaved, or set free, depending on the mood of the caliph. Women become sex slaves, the ones the right hand possesses, mentioned often in this relatively short text of the Quran. So this must have been important for this God. Now there's some noteworthy sentences which I need to quickly point out. One, the case of murder where the death penalty is the sanctioned retaliation. And now it says a free man for a free man, a slave for a slave, and a female for a female, establishing the ranks in Islam: man, slave, woman. Then you have female slaves where they can be simply convenient sex slaves, where a man can't have sex with any married woman, the married Muslim woman, no married woman except those whom your right hands possess. In other words, female slaves, even if they're married. The concept of sex slaves is mentioned several times, so it must have been important. Also, the Quran points out that master and slave are never equal. And then it goes all the way to free a slave is considered as a punishment. And they are war booty, captured females whose husbands, fathers, brothers, and all male relatives and friends with pubic hair have usually been killed, as is decreed in 3350. And those whom your right hand owns, of those whom Allah gave you as spoils of war. Now these spoils of war, which can be captured women, these are then addressed in several authentic hadiths in the Sunnah, where Muhammad advises his men to enjoy raping the female captives to the fullest and to not worry about getting them pregnant, which would reduce their price on the slave market. And that's why ISIL, Daesh, or whatever you want to call this terrorist bunch, they claim the right to do so simply following the example of Muhammad. There are endless examples of hadiths deemed as authentic by Muslim scholars where Muhammad himself has sex with his female slaves and even neglects his many wives in favor of a Christian slave girl. The Quran does not, and I repeat, not state it is forbidden or unlawful, haram, to own another human being. Quite the opposite. The rules on how to keep a slave are mentioned in dozens of sentences throughout the Quran. Only fellow Muslims should not be enslaved. So today, most Muslims are better than their God. Of course, you have the usual dualism in Islam, where the Quran decrees that a Muslim should write a letter of appreciation to and for the slave, under condition, however, that the slave must have some good in it, the will to serve Allah. It is then up to the person to do something, and I find this extremely disturbing, which is giving a human being their freedom. In other words, the freedom they did not previously have. And then there's an obscure sentence which is actually quite nonsensical and surrounded by esoteric mumbo-jumbo in 1913, freeing a neck. That's what it says, freeing a neck. And this is what some apologists consider to be the evidence that Islam eradicated slavery. It sounds like a bad joke at best, but it's actually callous and inhumane. Now, some Muslim apologists will make other dishonest claims, like mentioning slaves being given food and clothes, and this therefore constitutes just a different version of a work contract. These despicable hypocrites simply lie. Would they offer up their sisters, wives, or mothers as slaves? I mean, treating your slaves well is like saying, I only beat my wife on weekdays. It's horrific. It's disgusting. But they will claim that Islam did not initiate this practice. And Islam did not. But it should have ended it. If Muhammad, as is so often claimed, if he really was a nice person, he would have. He should have ended slavery. He did not. Instead, he enjoyed sex with his female slaves. So one last thing I need to point out now is that people had in the past and still have today both servants and slaves. Two very different conditions, where a servant is hired and paid, in other words, with a work contract. A slave, however, can be inherited or like a present. Like Muhammad's favorite sex slave, Maria, was a present to him. Now, in Islam, a man who does not have a lot of money, where it may be difficult for him to buy a normal free Muslim woman, he is allowed to buy a cheap female sex slave. If he so wishes, he can marry her later. Totally permissible in Islam. And some Muslims today still keep slaves of both types. Most Muslim apologists will defend the Quran and the statement that raping a married slave is permissible. While most Muslims are better than their God, most will not condemn these evil practices outright, simply because they are found in the Quran. So, does Islam propagate the abolishment of slavery? No, it actually regulates it and shows men how useful female slaves are, all the way to the wicked, ruthless and immoral example the character of Muhammad sets in the text, still valid today. Thanks for your time.